All right, let's talk about the first week of January 2026. It might not have felt like it at the time, but the world kind of quietly shifted on its axis. We're about to unpack how a bunch of seemingly separate crises all pointed to this disturbing new playbook in global politics, one where you make your power move first, and you worry about the legal questions later, if you worry about them at all. And this phrase right here, force first, law later, that's the absolute heart of our story today. It's this simple, kind of brutal logic that seems to be defining a whole new era of international relations. It's a world where might doesn't just make right, it creates an entirely new reality on the ground before anyone else can even react. So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a series of events all from that one week, from Venezuela to Greenland, from Iran to Ukraine. Now, on the surface, they look totally disconnected, but when you start to piece them together, this single, really powerful story emerges about how coercion is becoming, well, normal. And that story, it really begins in Venezuela. This wasn't just another crisis to watch on the news. No, this was a precedent-setting moment. It sent shockwaves across the globe, and it basically created a template that other countries are now forced to study very, very carefully. The scale of this whole operation was just staggering. I mean, this was not some subtle political maneuver. We're talking about President Maduro and his wife being physically brought into the U.S. judicial system. That image of him pleading not guilty in a New York courtroom, that was designed to project absolute finality. The message was unmistakable. The time for negotiation is over. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the core conflict here. The U.S. framed it as law enforcement, just, with some heavy-duty backup. But for much of the world, that's not what they saw. They saw a straight-up unilateral military operation. And they worried it was a really destabilizing move that actually weakens the very legal rules it was claiming to defend. The pressure didn't stop on land either. It immediately expanded offshore with a high-profile seizure of a tanker. And this is where it got really dicey because it blended sanctions enforcement with raw military capability, creating a direct friction point right there at sea, especially with Russia. And Moscow's reaction? It was blunt. They just came out and called it piracy. And that one single word tells you everything you need to know about how escalatory this event was. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental clash over the rules of the road, or, in this case, the shipping lanes. So this brings us to a really crucial question. If this is the new playbook with adversaries, what does that mean for your allies? Does the same logic apply to them? And that's not just a theoretical question, because that exact same week, the pressure started turning towards the Western camp itself.
Which brings us right to our second case, Greenland. And here, we see that same logic of coercion being applied, but not to an adversary. This time, it's being used within the Western alliance, and it's testing the very fabric of that alliance.
All of a sudden, this old idea of the U.S. buying Greenland was back on the table, and it was being framed as an active discussion. Europe's reaction was, let's just say, immediate and sharp. They didn't see it as some simple real estate deal. For them, it was about sovereignty, and it was about self-determination for the people who actually live in Greenland.
So why all the focus on Greenland? Well, you've got to understand it's a strategic gold mine. It is absolutely crucial for military bases and missile defense. It is packed with the critical minerals we all need for our modern supply chains, and, maybe most importantly, it raises these huge questions about the whole rules-based order the West says it upholds. Is consent from an ally still required when the most powerful member of the club wants something?
Now, it's important to remember, Venezuela and Greenland weren't happening in a vacuum. During that very same week, the world map was just lighting up with other pressure points, and each one reinforces this global pattern of coercion. So let's do a quick run-through. Over in Iran, you had protests sparking because the currency collapsed. These quickly turned into a political challenge. But the regime's response wasn't dialogue or trying to find a solution. It was a hard, immediate shift to brute force, with security forces cracking down violently to get control back. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, you saw this really jarring split screen. On one side, you have diplomats in Paris talking about security guarantees and ceasefires. At the exact same time, Russian strikes were systematically taking out Ukraine's energy grid in the middle of winter. You had diplomacy and destruction happening side by side, with military pressure being used to literally shape the facts on the ground while talks were still going on. And get this. In Yemen, even supposed allies were turning on each other.
The coalition that was fighting the Houthis began to fracture over who controlled key ports and airspace, and it exposed this really deep rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Coercive tactics and threats were now being used not against an enemy, but inside their own coalition. And in Syria, these super fragile integration deals were just collapsing back into open conflict. Renewed clashes around Aleppo displaced thousands of people, and it just showed how quickly these shaky agreements can go up in smoke when one side decides that force is a better tool than talking.
So let's zoom back out. When you put all of these pieces together, from Venezuela to Syria and everywhere in between, a really clear and honestly pretty uncomfortable picture emerges. This is the new global playbook. This is the age of coercion. And the playbook itself seems to have 3 simple steps. First, you act decisively. You create a new reality on the ground, whether that's arresting a leader or seizing a tanker. Second, you treat any debate that comes after as secondary because, hey, the deed is already done. And third, you just repeat this process until coercion is totally normalized as just a standard tool of foreign policy. So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Coercion isn't what you do when talks fail anymore. It's the opening move. It has become the primary negotiating instrument that you use to set the terms for any discussion that might follow. And you better believe every nation, big or small, is now planning for the aftershocks of this. They're all recalculating what they'll do now that these precedents have been set. And that leaves us with a final, pretty unsettling thought. If this is the new normal, if force really does come before law, what happens to the rules? You know, the ones that have governed the world for decades? What replaces them? That's the huge open question that's defining this new, very uncertain era.